Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to a place we often just see pretty pictures of, nomadic pastoralists. But how much do we actually know about how they live, especially in our crazy modern world?
Yeah, it's easy to romanticize it, isn't it? But pastoralism is a really complex way of life, full of challenges.
Right, so let's break it down a bit. When we talk about pastoralists, we mean people who depend on livestock for, everything, right?
Exactly. Sheep, goats, camels, cattle. These animals are at the core of everything. And because good grazing land isn't always around, these communities have figured out amazing systems to keep moving, migrating with the seasons to find the best spots.
So it's not just wandering around. They have a whole science behind it.
Oh, absolutely. It's not random at all. They build on generations of knowledge, about weather patterns, the terrain, and where and when resources will be available. Pastoralists are masters at reading the land. They see these tiny clues that tell them when to move and where to go.
That's so cool. So, like in the Himalayas, for example, how does this play out in a place like that?
Oh, the Himalayas are the perfect example. The terrain is so varied and the seasons are completely different. The Gujar Bakarwals, for instance, they spend their summers way up high in the meadows of Kashmir. Their flocks graze on the lush new grass that grows after the snow melts.
Okay, so picture this. You're up in the mountains, gorgeous views all around, cool fresh air. Sounds pretty idyllic, doesn't it? But it can't all be beautiful scenery.
Hmm.
What are some of the tough parts?
It's definitely not a walk in the park. These kafila journeys, that's what they call them, they're incredibly difficult. Think about crossing steep, rocky paths, sometimes for weeks straight, with all their belongings and all those animals. Plus, they're always dealing with unpredictable weather, sudden snowstorms, huge downpours of rain, you name it.
Wow, sounds intense. And I bet winters are even worse.
Oh, yeah. As winter comes, the Gujar Bakarwals head down to the lower hills, to the Siwaliks. Temperatures are milder there, and they can still find some grazing. This whole migration back and forth is crucial for their survival.
So their entire lives are based on this constant movement, adapting to the seasons all the time.
Precisely. And it's not only about finding food for their animals either. These movements often connect with the needs of settled communities, too.
Huh, that's interesting. How so?
Well, think of the Gadi shepherds in Himachal Pradesh. They spend summers in the high regions of Lahul and Spiti with their sheep and goats. But they plan it so their descent happens just when the harvest starts in the lower valleys.
So they're not just herders, they're part of the whole farming cycle too.
Exactly. They work with the local farmers, helping with the harvest. They get their own crops, and then when they move down with their animals, they graze on the leftovers in the fields, which acts as natural fertilizer. It's a really neat example of how pastoralists and settled communities depend on each other.
Yeah, it shows how ways of life that seem totally separate are actually all connected.
Right. And it's not just in the Himalayas either. We see these kinds of patterns everywhere in India, in the plateaus of Maharashtra, even the deserts of Rajasthan.
So even in a place as harsh as the Thar Desert, you're saying there are pastoralists who make it work.
Absolutely. Look at the Raikas of Rajasthan. They've figured out how to live in one of the toughest environments there is. Herding camels and sheep, traveling huge distances for scarce resources. And they combine that with farming, growing crops when the rains come, and depending on their livestock in the dry months.
Wow, that's some serious resilience. So there's way more to pastoralism than meets the eye. It's not just about the animals. It's a whole way of life, all this knowledge, skills, adaptations that let these communities survive for centuries.
You got it. And a lot of people miss this. They actually play a huge ecological role. All that moving around prevents overgrazing and helps plants regrow. It's a sustainable system that's worked for generations.
Until colonialism came along and messed things up.
Yeah, that's when we see a big change. And well, that's a whole other story.
Right, so we were talking about this balance, how pastoralists fit into their environment. But then colonialism shows up and, well, that usually means trouble. What happened here?
Yeah, it was a big disruption for sure. Colonial rule, they had a totally different view of land, all about making money, not about traditional ways. They saw all that land the pastoralists use as just empty, wasted space, perfect for turning into farms.
That's a pretty limited way of looking at it. Did they just not get how important those grazing grounds were for the environment?
I don't know, maybe they didn't want to get it. They brought in these things called wasteland rules. Basically, they could just take over the land and give it to anyone who would farm it. That was a huge chunk of grazing land gone, just like that.
Wow. Sounds like they were trying to wipe out a whole way of life, just imposing their ideas, not caring about what was already there. Were there any other policies that messed things up for pastoralists?
Oh, yeah. The Forest Acts, those were a major problem too. The idea was to categorize and control all the forests. So some forests, the ones with valuable timber especially, those became reserved, like totally off limits. Pastoralists couldn't even go there.
Seriously. They couldn't even set foot in those areas. What about the other forests?
Well, those were protected, so grazing was okay,
Right.
but with a ton of rules and permits. You could only go in at certain times, stay for a short period, and if you stayed too long, huge fines.
Sounds like they were always jumping through hoops just to survive,
Mhm.
and they were managing those lands just fine for centuries before all these rules.
I know, right? It's kind of ironic, isn't it? The colonial officials, they said they were doing all this to protect the forests, said that grazing destroyed young trees, stopped forests from growing.
But didn't we just say that pastoralists actually help keep the ecosystems healthy? All that moving around prevented overgrazing, let the plants grow back naturally?
Exactly. A lot of times those colonial interventions backfired. They messed up the balance that was already there, sometimes even caused more overgrazing in some areas.
They were losing their land and getting blamed for damage they didn't cause. Then there was the Criminal Tribes Act, right? That sounds even worse.
Yeah, the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, that's a pretty dark part of history. Basically, it made entire communities into criminals. A lot of nomadic groups, including pastoralists.
You mean just for being who they were? That's crazy.
It was pure prejudice. They didn't understand anything. They called these communities criminal by nature just because of their way of life.
So just being nomadic was a crime. That's wild.
It is. And the effects were terrible. Pastoralists were always being watched, had to register with the police. Their movements were totally restricted. Imagine the fear they must have felt, never knowing what would happen.
It's just awful. Their whole way of life criminalized because it didn't fit the colonial way. And on top of all that, you said they had to pay taxes too.
Yeah, that's right. On top of everything else, they had grazing taxes, another way to squeeze money out of these people who were already struggling. And those taxes, collected in brutal, unfair ways a lot of the time.
It's unbelievable. Lost their grazing lands, branded as criminals, can't move freely, and they get taxed for feeding their animals. It's like an all-out attack.
It was a systematic attack, and it really hurt pastoral communities all over India. Their herds got smaller, their incomes went down. A lot of them ended up in debt just trying to make ends meet.
It's a pretty grim picture. But these communities didn't just vanish, did they?
No, they didn't. They were up against a lot, but they were incredibly resilient. They found ways to adapt, to resist, to hold on to their traditions. That's what we'll look at next.
I mean, it's amazing they even survived all that, you know what I mean, during colonial rule. But pastoralists are tough, like we said. How did they make it? How did they adapt with all that going wrong?
Well, they had to, right? It was change or disappear. And they changed. They were incredibly resourceful, really understood their environment. Some groups, they shrunk their herds, figured out that smaller grazing areas meant fewer animals.
I bet that was hard.
Yeah.
Livestock are so important, not just for their livelihood, but culturally too, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It wasn't just about the economics. It was a whole shift in their culture. But they adapted in other ways, too. They looked for new places to graze, found whole new migration routes.
Oh, really? Like what? Any examples come to mind?
Well, there's the Raikas. After partition happened, they couldn't get to their usual grazing lands anymore. That became part of Pakistan. So they changed everything up, went to Haryana instead. And it turned out to be a good move.
What was so special about Haryana?
Turns out the farm fields there, they needed manure after the harvest, and the Raikas' sheep. Well, they provided it. Worked out great for both sides. Raikas got new grazing land. Farmers got their natural fertilizer. It's a great example of how they adapted, found solutions even when things were changing all around them.
Yeah, turning a bad situation into something good. Did other groups find different ways to cope?
A lot of them started doing more than just herding. Couldn't just rely on livestock anymore, so they got into trading or weaving, even took on other jobs for wages. It was tough, that shift, but it kept them going.
So they kind of had to join the regular economy, even if it meant leaving their old ways behind.
Pretty much. And that had its own effects, too, socially. Some pastoralists, the wealthier ones, they could buy land, settle down. Others struggled, fell into debt. It created these new class differences within their communities.
Yeah, sounds like what was happening in the rest of society at that time, too. But with all this change, did they manage to keep their knowledge about the environment, their traditional practices?
For the most part, yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting today. Climate change, environmental problems, all that. Well, what pastoralists know, it's more valuable than ever.
Right. They've been living sustainably in these difficult places for so long.
Yeah.
What can we learn from them specifically?
Well, they really understand the seasons, how grazing works, water management.
Hmm.
They have so much knowledge about how to use resources without destroying them. And because they're always moving, they can adapt to change easily. And in a world where the weather's going crazy, that's super important.
So what people used to think was backwards, maybe even inefficient, could be the key to a better future.
It's definitely something to think about, isn't it? How close they are to the land, how they adapt their community-based ways. There's a lot we can learn.
It's pretty amazing to think that, these ancient traditions might have answers to our biggest problems today.
And their story shows us, don't dismiss traditional knowledge. There's a lot of wisdom there passed down for generations.
Well, that was fascinating. Started with these romantic pictures of pastoralists, ended up with a much more complex reality. But in the end, I feel hopeful.
Hopeful that we can learn from how resilient they are, how they adapt, maybe even rediscover a way of life that's more in tune with nature.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.